Well, hello there. So welcome to my little bit of FBDM. It is a glorious day in the park today, I bet. Sad that we can't be all there together, but hopefully you've been enjoying the feed all day here for FBDM MCAF. For my little bit, I'm going to look at some interesting storytelling by a couple of masters of the form. But first, a little context. Who am I? My name is Salgood Sam. It's actually Max Douglas. It's a pen name. My name backwards. Very long story. And I've been making comics for a long time, about 30 years now. And the last little while, I focused on creator-owned stuff. And the stuff you're seeing on the screen right now is the last bunch of books that I'm pretty pleased with. Over on this side, we have Therefore Repent and Dream Life and Revolvers, which there's actually more Revolvers, but these are the only ones you can buy now. It's a personal anthology series, short stories and things I'm doing. Late last year, we published Dracula, Son of the Dragon. It was a very long haul to get done, but finally got published from Comixology. You can get it digitally if you want. It's supposed to come in print, but there's some been hang-ups, and now with the COVID. But it will be coming, and that was with Mark Sable, and pretty happy with it. And then underneath that, you see the book, Mind Engines, this way. That was supposed to be published at FBDM. Unfortunately, everything happened, and I decided to postpone it and keep working on stuff. But I thought before I get rolling, and just to give you some more of the context, I'd give you a peek at the work in progress. So what you're about to see is a quick scroll through my work in progress folder of the art that I've been doing that's going into Mind Engine. It's going to be an ongoing new personal anthology series, black and white, variety of short stories, different subjects, different genres. Some of it's memoir, some sci-fi, some, I hate the term, but slice of life. So hopefully you'll be able to check that out. And, you know, I do the whole Patreon thing. If you're a member there, you can check it out and read it there, or the work in progress there, along with all my other independent stuff. So today, I'm going to look at a piece of work that was pretty formatively impressive, well, impressive too, but formative. There we go. That's the term I wanted anyway. And that's by Dave McKean, and The Journal of Trois by Fabio Snow. And they're both kind of struck me quite strongly when I first encountered them. Cages originally came out as a series of single individual books in the 90s. And they were all from Tundra, and I picked them up as they came out. And then when this nice, handsome hardcover came out, I grabbed that as well. The Journal of Trois, there's actually a later edition. I believe I have the first edition. The later one includes content that Fabrice thought that he was censoring himself, so he included more material in a later edition. Sadly, I do not have that. I have, I believe, the first. And they both are very different books. There's not a lot about them that you could actually directly compare other than this one piece. But when I stumbled across the scene in this book, I was immediately reminded of one in that. And I have an interest in generally in formalism and visual storytelling on comics. The way formalism is the way the comics work, the mechanisms of how page design communicates story and visuals and symbols, etc. And when I was doing research for this, I remembered I actually have some earlier work of Fabrice's in this book. So this is Beaux-Arts Magazine's What Are Comics Today special. They had a couple of these. And there are two things in it from Fabrice. One's of just a profile, but the other is this actually very appropriate story what I was just talking about, which is a history of the medium. So I'm going to quickly look through it. It's a little 8-page short story, and it's sort of relevant. This is actually like something I basically do at the beginning of my making comics class. I teach a class in comics at Sim Studio in Montreal. And we go over the history of comics and what it is, which I think is kind of relevant because a lot of people look at the medium as some sort of like bastard child of a hybrid of pictures and words. And I don't believe that's true, because really human language began with not just pictures, but iconography, symbols. And even before we started having things like these clay tablets, what Fabrice wouldn't have known when he did this in, what was the year on that one again? I think this is early aughts. Fairly recently, they've put together markings from all across the globe that are all similar in early primitive cave paintings. So around the same area as these more representational paintings that would have been little symbols that humans were using, or proto-humans were using all over the planet, that look the same. They may have meaned different things to them, but they were all sharing the same iconography. So we were using icons that were for ideas or perhaps even spoken words, and visual symbols that represented actual things early on. And I feel like Fabrice has summed that up nicely in this Wordless comic, and that's part of why I'm showing it as well. This is yet another Wordless comic, and it's showing the history of use of images in sequence with language to tell stories. There's Toffler, who gets the credit of being the first comic book artist, so he was putting these in booklets to tell funny stories. The European printing press, there was actually Chinese printing presses before that, but not as systematized and didn't have the prefab lettering. And we get into later on with McKay and the Yellow Kid. I like this nice little triptych with the balloon and the word balloon and the phonograph. And so it's also kind of lets me start getting into the idea that a lot of comics work on symbols and the juxtaposition of similar or different symbols and the ideas that create between them. So like right here, Disney being shocked by the entry of the superheroes in the Marvel era. And then so around, I think I'm reading this right. I think Fabrice means this is to be like the intermixing of influences from different quarters, something like that. There's like these little, almost like cells connecting. And here we have the burgeoning young ninth art sort of being christened. So I know that in French and European culture, comics were sort of deemed ninth art around just after World War II. But of course, at first, the snobbery of the other arts, the other 8 arts, don't like it, burn. But then along comes Scott McCloud, and we are saved, and so on. So I feel like it's like a cute little survey. This is actually a really cool book if you can find yourself a copy. It's just like one-page previews of artists and all their amazing work. Now, that's not really the main show, though. The main show are these two. Now, first, I'm going to look at this. This came out, I was already working at Marvel. I had become really struck by Dave McKean's work when I was in high school, first getting set on the idea of making comics for a living. And this was, I think, one of his first big ventures as not just an artist, but also the storyteller, the writer. And it has a lot of interesting formalist quirks. This is one of the covers. So like the first little while we get all the covers. But early in the book, I'm not going to look at the whole thing, of course, but I want to cover this. He does this interesting thing where we have these creation stories. This is key to the themes of the book itself. And it repeats. So there's one, and then another in the beginning creation story. And then another in the beginning creation story. And then another in the beginning creation story. And I think, is that it? Yes. And then we get into the comic, which of course begins with a cat. So how can you not love that? And it's a wordless sequence. There are a lot of cages that goes for pages without words. And when when there are words, it's not especially wordy. It also sticks to this 9-panel grid quite a bit. And a lot of it is this black and white with a gray midtone. But then he also experiments stylistically. So here we have photo collage with looks like almost painted cutouts. I'm not entirely sure on all the technique, whether this was pasted in afterwards or done with the photographs. I also know his wife is credited on this book as a contributing artist. And I think no, not there. I want this. There we go. I think she might even be the model here with this child and kid in these photo sections. And here's another shift in style. This is another fairy tale story within a story of a king. The story of Babylon. The Tower of Babylon. Or sorry, Tower of Babel, not the story of Babylon, sorry. I like this is like a medieval script trick where the word balloons are like banners that come out of people's mouths. You'll see this in old illuminations. So as a young artist who I'd just been working in Marvel for a few years, I was finding the constraints of commercial work very unenjoyable. And I really loved looking at this book. He'd already impressed me with Signal and Noise and Violent Cases and many other works on his versatility and experimentation. And I kind of always wanted to do that. But when I was doing commercial work, that just wasn't on the table with my editors. So I looked at a lot of this for inspiration and ideas, and eventually part of the reason I kind of broke away and decided to just do my own comics was the wanting to have this sort of creative freedom. There was a panel earlier today I was watching, and they were talking about people being able to draw other people's ideas versus doing your own. And technically, I'm capable of drawing people's ideas. I don't mind doing it for short commercial jobs. But when it comes to longer works and this time commitment that goes into doing something like a graphic novel, it's always a problem. And I've realized in the end, I should just write my own stories. But as you can see here, there's a mix. Some of this is sort of almost like storybook, not your traditional comics. And it goes through all sorts of interesting visual metaphors and styles. These key characters are important. So right around, let's see, we'll start here at the beginning of chapter 7. So this is, I believe, in book 5 of the series. There's 10 books for Cages when it first came out. And here we have the main character is an artist. He's reading and looking at a sketchbook and reflecting on sketches. And I feel like he's sort of flashing between the drawings and the memories. And then here, this is a neighbor across the way who he's been watching through a window and getting to know vicariously as a voyeur. He's waiting outside a bar, and the bartender shows up, notes that he's there early, and he's not quite ready to open. But then he's opened, he goes in. We cut away to another scene, and you notice most of that was silent. And this is a writer, a different character, lives in a different floor of the apartment building that the artist lives in. And we have this really interesting scene where he's living memories through the spines of books on his bookshelf. So I believe this is something to do with the title of the book. I forget the details now of the story behind that particular book. I think it's tied to what his current condition is in his life. Seeing this sort of drama play out. I like the use of like all gray for memory versus black for now. So another good example of sort of a nice formalist tool, and then he sort of comes to in the kitchen with his wife, who finally tries to get his attention. And he clues in. And she asks him if he wants milk. So it's still chapter 7, but now we're back at the bar. And this gets us to where the scene that I want to focus on. There's a bit of a preamble. So the artist is at a table in this jazz bar, and up walks his neighbor. And he's loaned a book to somebody as a musician who hangs around the same building that he loaned a book. And she says, "A friend asked me to return this book to you. Return your book, huh?" He could have given it back himself. Only he's over there grinning. And so do you spy on your other neighbors too? So he's been ratted out. So this awkward introduction results in a short conversation that we get to actually sit in on. We get to all the dialogue. And she starts looking through the drawings with him. And it's interesting. It's one of McKean's talents is to take this sort of repetitive conversation and still make it engaging to look at. The pantomime is very effective and the drawing style is really interesting. But then right about here, things shift. And she's asked him a question and he goes, "Okay, God, I could talk all night about my paintings." So at this point, McKean shifts. So we go from, and I want to note, in a list of interesting formless little ticks that Fabrice also touched on, see how the panel switches. It's almost like a positive negative switch. And again, and notice the musician. So this is the fellow who conspired to have them meet playing. And music becomes a framing metaphor for the following sequence, which is wordless. And there's a lot of movement, but I think the movement is meant to be a way of communicating the movements of sound and music, but also the dynamics of their conversation that's occurring at this table. And we do a lot of flashing. So the pantomime between faces that we've already established shifts. The camera's moving tight, and really quickly we move into this abstracted design that then skews long across the page. So as a comics novice might not necessarily think about, but most makers will know that the standard reading format is like most text, so left, right, down. It's called the zigzag. Left, right, down, left, right, down. And we get that here, but then it zags long out, like a note playing out, and they dance. And the lines become lovely little abstracted, looks like maybe brush, could be a soft nib, but that's a lot of line weight variation. So he's really pressing to get that weight if it's a nib. And then down this side. So we went up and then down to our jazz musician playing the notes, which play through gaps, breaks in the white space. That sort of defines the people. I definitely took some personal inspiration from this, from my own comics. Specifically, this kind of imagery directly influenced a panel I did in a book called The Rise and Fall of It All. And you see a horn player here playing away, and sort of the non-traditional reading flows that I liked playing with in that story and in many of my works. So I feel like that's a really interesting tact. And even the way he's sort of bringing you in here, does that reflect there? It does. So the stuff goes up through the top and down through the top. And then we've got our black lines and solid black fills back, but everything's become abstracted. And notice that the text has been replaced by pictograms, and pictograms in the word balloons, but also occasionally in heads, like thoughts. Like the music's infecting his brain, and then there's we're looking at it looks like a guitar. I need my reading glasses. I forget that was a guitar or violin. That's a violin. There we go. It's a violin. And I like how the wine is present, but it's drifted off. Like they stopped thinking about that. And they're clearly engrossed in discussing art. Looks like primitive art, like cave paintings. Text that we are not able to actually read. I've looked at that with a magnifying glass, and it's all broken up. I don't know if you guys can see that. Let's see. Can I make a cam actually use? Oh, that's hard to coordinate. Let's see. Sort of. Trust me, it's been like reproduced several times, so you can't really there. You might be able to read a bit of it. I'm not sure if it's important, but some of these images are clearly specific. This looks like images out of Dante's Inferno, and here we have a representation of a clay pottery urn. Some looks like Romance era painting, but it's sort of skewed. Everything's been looks like it's been run copy a dozen times. There's architecture and Byzantine paintings. So icons for the subject matter of the conversations they're having. And then it goes totally abstract. We have music layered in behind. I see a face. I could be projecting, but I think these are elements of features and faces, but it's only starts beginning to suggest, oh, look, there's a wine glass, that there's form as we tumble through the last part. And then all of the accoutrements of the table come crashing down to land on the table in a black field. We fade to black and then pull out as our musician who contrived this meaning walks away, and they notice how long, 2:30. Where'd the time go? And they are the last left in the bar as the bartender asks them to leave. Now, this chapter continues for a little bit. I'm going to skirt through it really quickly. So these are little subsections of chapter 7. Have they already? Yes, I think they go to her apartment. And then we see the author and his wife in his place, but then we come back to here. Oh no, they're in his studio. Sorry, that's right. And we're looking at his paintings, and I think he's painting her. He's drawing her. I'd forgotten that that's where they went first. But then, that's why I was thinking her place, because they go to her place, and she has a forester in her apartment, which is just like a continuation of the magic realism. So part of the reason I wanted to show all of this is that wasn't just sort of a one-off silent wordless scene with lots of visual metaphor and magic realism. That's a running theme throughout this book. And one of the things that differentiates it from journalism, this is, while it's not a genre book or an adventure book or any of that sort of thing, it is also not a reality-based book in the sense that it's confined to the limits of reality. It's a magic realist or surrealist book, probably a bit of both. And like a lot of things in that ballpark, it's talking about real life, but uses devices of magic realism and imagination to talk about things that aren't in the text and about emotions and ideas. And again, this composition and this feeling had a pretty big impact on me. So it ended up leading to a a 4-page story I did, at the end of it, I used some similar visual stylizations that were very directly inspired by that. As I walk into a forest that is the rooms and walls and ceilings around us. There's a story called Where the Wild Things Went, an ode to Sendak, but also my first years in Montreal. I just did, by the way, small plug, the Letters of Montreal, the new anthology that FBDM put out. I have a short story in that. That's sort of a follow-up to my Where the Wild Things Went. So yeah, it's a really fascinating piece of work. It's extremely rich. There's a lot of, I was looking for, a lot of huge open layouts like this. So we're making a transition there, again, between realism. So here's our musician. Here's this giant stone in his studio, which is very interesting. Cages is a book by the author who lives in the apartment. And then he listens to the stone. And then we go into this sequence that leads to what we saw earlier. Mother and child, these strange creatures appear, and then we go into the story of the Tower of Babel. So it's quite the hefty book, about 500 pages, and it drifts in and out of realism freely. And I think that's striking, because Fabrice does something very different. Now, the journal series are autobiography, memoir, and they're very painstaking. In my research, I did a little reading. Fabrice has an extremely well-drafted drawing style. So his work, this is the main character, well, Fabrice and Dominic. He talks about in interviews his desire to get likenesses very, very accurate, and his rendering is generally very painstaking. Having done a lot of comics, I can tell you that managing to nail a character repeatedly this accurately over and over and over and over again from different angles, particularly in some cases, some of these people who, from what I understand, were not entirely willing models. That takes some work. And his main desire for doing that is that he feels like to relate to them as real people, you need that veracity. But then also he's not against abstraction and symbolism, as you can see, the plain space here, but he wants to create a high plateau of realism that you can then underneath build in all sorts of interesting experiments with abstraction. So look again, remember the positive negative switch. This is a quirk that I've noticed frequently he'll use to symbolize shifts in emotion. And then here also the lines get ragged when his anger gets intense. The art reflects his mood. It's very calm here. He's initially calling and then gets aggravated. Wanted to point out right away, too, there's a symbol, this tree. This tree represents Fabrice's notion, I think, if I'm reading it correctly, of his family and where he lives in his family. And at the end of it, slight spoiler, I won't give away the whole thing, but we see the tree again. Now, there are the trees in the book, but I believe there are 3 places in which this particular tree occurs. I've looked through a few times, and I can only find it in 3 places. I might have missed something. I should actually say, full disclosure up front, my ability to read this book is sadly limited by my limited French skills. I had a very interesting conversation with Fabrice last week, actually, on Facebook, to ask him some questions about this book. And we were able to struggle through because I had very limited French and he has very limited English. When I first moved to Montreal, my plan was to become fully bilingual. It turns out being dyslexic slightly complicates that. So I have had about 2/3 of this book read to me by an old ex-girlfriend many years ago. And then I've sort of, puzzled through and used auto-translate to figure out parts. I don't think I've really enjoyed it the way a native speaker or native reader in this case would be able to, but I think I've got the gist of it. So yeah, this tree symbol, that's important. It's going to come up in a second. So I'm reading through this book. It's so Fabrice said himself, he's been accused many times of being wordy. It's a very text-heavy storytelling. Not excessively so, and there are many moments where he lets it drop, and we let the pictures tell the story. So it's not like it's a deficit or something, but he has a lot to say, and I can relate to that. I wrestle with trying to limit, and sometimes dialogue is necessary. I don't really do the captions very much, but I find that my keep my dialogue minimal. It's tricky. But very early on, chapter 5, which right away, this could be just coincidence. I didn't get a chance to confirm this particular coincidence, but chapter 5 versus book 5. Book 5 is where the sequence that I showed you occurs in Cages, and chapter 5. Now, chapter 5 in this book is not the middle. Book 5 in Cages is the middle. This is very early in the story, just to show you where we are. And what we're doing is we're setting up a dynamic. So I don't think it's a spoiler to say the primary narrative of this book is Fabrice is a gay man, and he has a crush on Dominic, a fellow cartoonist. They're both members, I believe, of the Ego X collective that published this book. Sadly defunct now, but they were some avant-garde, all the ones that I've seen, amazing cartoonists, do really interesting work. And they had a friendship, but Fabrice also had a crush. And there's a little bit of contextualizing text. We get the date, where they are, and then we shift into the conversation beginning. And I believe this is sort of like the moment of both full blossoming of his infatuation, but also, we will see, it doesn't quite work out the same. But I wanted to note sort of the repetitions, just like we had with Dave McKean's work, the 9-panel grid. Not quite as much back and forth, though. Fabrice does moment-to-moment sequences quite a lot. I like the little things here, like the eyes are out of focus, and the hands are talking. So when I asked Fabrice about some of his thinking behind this, one of the things he brought up is that, so he had been taken criticism that his work was very wordy, and this whole chapter was an attempt for him to sort of exercise that and see if he could do something different. So he had a couple of different sources of inspiration. One of them indeed turns out was Cages, and I was curious because this is about, I don't know if this is relevant, but the time period that this book covers is exactly the time period this book was originally published. I wondered if maybe it's just contextual that he'd just seen it. But his other sources of inspiration were the Oulipo, Workshop for Potential Literature, constraints and sort of patterns and formalist limitations and repetition. And I'm not sure that he actually used a mathematical algorithm for this story at all. When I didn't get a direct answer to that question, but he was definitely sort of thinking about it loosely. And he also wanted to play with the idea of a fugue. And in this case, he says that there are 4 voices. So there are the faces and hands. And then there's also, what is it again? I'm just looking at my list again. Hands and voices. Oh yeah, right. So there's 4. His hands and his voice, and his hands and his voice. So Dominic and Fabrice. And then, of course, so we have this focus on hand gesture, hence the moment-to-moment sequences. And I think there are some back and forth moments, but a lot of times we get these to communicate the animation of talking with your hands. And as they get more and more engaged, this happens. And that strikes me as being very similar in some ways to the moment in Cages. So I won't pull that open yet. We'll get to the direct comparisons in a minute. And music shows up, but the first metaphor is whirling dancers. So he's kind of playing with both. But we also get the whirling dancers with the actual conversation in Cages. I feel like dance and movement dominate Fabrice's visual metaphors or allegories, and music dominates his a little bit, but that can be subjectively debated. Field of hay bales. There's a famous painting. Travel, I assume. I'm thinking because he's gesturing. He seems fairly athletic in the story as well, so I think that's his fixation with the Olympics. And then we do this. And so we get a little bit of the similar exploration of abstraction. Notice Fabrice leaning into, and they blend and bleed together as the cups and drinks and the table kind of float up and become part of the smoke of the figures. So this last image is quite striking. It's not the last image, but it's like the last super abstracted image. Then we go to the hands, and word balloons here, but they appear to be scribbling. There's a vague little moments where it looks like a letter or something, and there's an A and there's an A, but we can't actually read them. He's thinking about music in his head. I assume he's talking as well, so there's a discussion of that. This seems to be punk, maybe. So they're talking about their fascinations. We have the word balloons with pictograms. Bach, I believe. I'm not sure the musician, but he's holding a microphone. Scripts of music. Handschrift. Bach's handschrift is I looked it up. It's a name of one of Bach's collections. There we have Pollock. And I'm not sure if there's a reference of painting. It is a reference of painting, but also I think it's sort of a reference to desire. Picasso. Hopper. I can't remember the name of that artist. Writing. I want to say, I'm not sure. I was going to say Tesla, but I don't think that's Tesla. I don't recognize that particular individual, but they're sharing their interests and admirations and fascinations. And I like this like constant shifting and the eyes being blank. And these are a kind of, I believe, chocolate. They look like some chocolates I've had anyway. I'm not sure if that's what he had in mind, playing scraps. There's Freud. And here is a key point. He talks about family and his relatively small family. And he said, I don't have a small family. I have a huge family. And suddenly he feels like, notice the eyes are kind of blanked. And it's just him sitting kind of hunched. And it feels isolated. Like the word, there's not even a balloon for it. It's just there, almost like it popped. And the moment holds. And we get that positive, negative switch. Absent father, broken limb. A very full tree, full of labels. He knows his family, knows his roots. And then the black drains out, and he switches, and they positive, negative flip, and we see the broken tree again. And that's the end of the chapter. So this one doesn't continue on. There's more. There are probably a few other wordless scenes and experimentations with, formalism here. We have the sketch. It's very active as a practice in general, his work. He has a lot of formalist experiments. There's a really intense scene where he gets beaten, and then they have a strong visual metaphor for how he feels about it later on. But a lot of his work is much more drafted. So McKean tends towards a more painterly approach to drawing, whereas Fabrice has a more drafted approach. So let's look at them side by side for a second. And so, yeah, Fabrice definitely confirmed that this was a source of inspiration for him. But I think it's sort of striking as creators to look at the way the different executions sort of play out a little bit. So that's the goal here. I want this section. Yes. So the preamble sequence is much shorter. This one is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Wait, I didn't even count that right. Well, several. You get the point. But once we get through that, here's how things sort of shift gears together. And I'm not sure, I feel like that almost, it's not like there's a one-to-one, but I think Fabrice spends more time playing with his metaphors, like at this point, I think this is more, I'm guessing, it's more about his sensation of the moment. There's sort of this blossoming of thoughts and feelings he's having about this conversation, about this person, about Dominique. Now, sort of the punchline, of course, to that is that Dominique, it's not reciprocated. Dominique's not into that. But here we go into, I guess that's pretty much the moment where this shifts as well as abstraction. And I think that's the other interesting difference is that McKean involves this third party, the impresario who puts them together. But we get this, and that's somewhat applicable to, I think, this section. And then with the visual word balloons, I think this is interesting in that he's so much more specific. His pictorial word balloons, if you do the effort, like some of these I recognize right away. Others, I just don't know enough about the specific subjects to identify the faces or things. But even when it's sort of generalized, it's very specific. That's a particular typewriter. It's a use of icon that isn't ambiguous in any way. So his pictorial word balloons are as specific as language. McKean, like his drawing here, gets abstract, and his pictorial word balloons, like intentionally, are legible, and you could figure out what this is from. It's clearly a Byzantine representation of the Virgin Mother and the baby, but it's a little hard to make out, and probably intentionally so. So there are ideas there, but they're left to the readers to specify and be clear about. Let me know if you guys have any questions, by the way. They're watching in the chat, and then it will feed it to me. I also really find this quite interesting, how often he does this absence of eyes. So they're not quite absent there. It's like it's closed, but they just completely disappear at times. I never got a chance to get back to Fabrice and ask him questions about that, unfortunately. And I feel like I'm really interested in one of the things I would like to talk to him more about is he always keeps a grid, you'll notice. And for the most part, so does McKean. And that's an area where I like to go even further. So not to toot my own horn, but for context, I like to get the same kind of flow that we have here, but even more open and abstract, so that you kind of lose the sense of a grid structure on the page. And I'm curious about why they didn't want to go further. And if you're doing a comic like this, like here, I feel like they're breaking the grid, but only just. The grid's there to contextualize the break of the grid. So. Notice the hand in the hand. Sort of displaced, or I guess it's still in the sort of location. So yeah. The drafting technique is also strikingly different. Like there are moments here where this sort of rendering feels similar to what he's doing, but most of the time he has this very painstaking, it's mostly nib. I've got to watch a couple of videos of him working, and he works with the dip nib. Well, he doesn't dip his nib. Neat little trick. He uses the dauber to put the ink on the nib, which I guess sort of helps sidetrack the control issue. When you're dipping nibs, you're always having to manage the ink load. Some dry brush. A lot more photo reference. McKean uses photo reference though too, and it's interesting like how he sort of feels free to abstract, and I wonder how he would feel about Fabrice's notions of I mentioned before, the specificity of likeness helps anchor your read of the person as a real person, not as sort of just an avatar for character. I'm fairly certain McKean would probably disagree. I'm curious how vehemently so. Let's take another closer look. I'm going to zoom in just a tad. Oops. Give me a sec. I'll move my mouse to another window. There we go. I want to jump in so we can get a good close look. I particularly like his use of hatching for shading. It's very well pulled off. Even little subtleties there. You guys probably can't quite see that. But just the different tones for slight bounce light effects. The sunflower field makes me wonder what his direct sources of inspiration are. That, I mean, it's sort of an obvious one, being Van Gogh, but they don't feel like Van Gogh sunflowers, so probably not. And here this feels like clover. Is it clover or flowers? So one of the interesting things about black and white, I'm doing all my current work in black and white out of preference, but also technical reasons. It's faster. But it does leave the reader open to project and put onto the work more. McLeod talks about this a little bit, where he talks about abstraction and simplification is supposed to make it easier to project and for the readers to project meaning or even itself onto a character. I suspect McKean might think that way. I'm not entirely sure that's always true, but one thing I do think is when you get as specific and particular in your rendering as I tend to and Fabrice does, when you add color, you're taking something off the table in terms of the reader's ability to infer and bring something as storytellers. When you read a story, you become engaged in the storytelling. You're part of the process. You become a participant in the building of the story as you turn each page and how you interpret the images. And scenes like this, where they're wordless and leaves it free to you to infer meaning, that's sort of obvious. But even with a scene like this, where there is very particular dialogue, someone punched him in the face, there's no doubt about it as to why. You know, he looked at someone the wrong way as far as that guy was concerned. This is the Ego X crew, all the artists hanging out. And I find it amusing that they're all saying, "Ma père, ma uncle, ma mère," their fathers, their mothers, their uncles. I remember reading this a while back and thinking that they're basically just sort of talking about why they do things. So there's with a scene like this, to get back to what I was talking about, we have this very particular language and art. And if we add color to that, there's almost nothing left for the reader to interject. So the black and white art, I feel like we're leaving a window open. I'm not sure if Fabrice would agree, but it means that it's not as didactic. It allows the readers to now imagine at least something. And when you have little moments like this, a face that's out of focus, and generally the absence of color, it gives room for the reader's imaginations to broaden and fill in the blanks. So even when you have something that feels this drafted and this nailed down and this specific with very particular text, the choice of black and white gives us room for our audience to do what they do. And then you give them a scene like this, and then they can dance with you and read this emotional dynamic how they like. So what ends up happening is this sets up the frame. There's a certain scene earlier that establishes Fabrice's appetite for sex and companionship and love. I know that's one of the things that gets elaborated in the later edition. He felt he censored it a little bit and had to kind of really go for it and be honest with people about that. This one gives us the intensity, the idea of how much he has feelings for Dominique, but then also how much he realizes very early on that there is a difference, a wall between them. And of course, that's even when you don't know that someone's not interested in you at all, or they're just a different orientation, as in the cases here. Even without that difference of background and kind can be intimidating. So the rest of the book focuses on the complexities of his life as a gay man and having a fascination for somebody who is unavailable to him. And that struck me as being especially interesting because this is the inverted romantic scenario. This is a complicated book, and I can't remember exactly if you would say that it has a happy ending, but these characters do end up together in the end. I'm at the back of the book here, as a cat jumps into a black painting. And it has a lot of romantic notions. It also doesn't really, it's very cisgendered too. So just to know that we're talking about a book here from a gay man's point of view, this is as far as I can remember, there are no homosexual characters in this book. And this is a very typical romantic kind of first meeting, and then they fall romantically in love and lose track of time, and it just keeps going even after they get kicked out of the bar. It has such a different bracketing, and yet they use so many of the same devices to communicate the emotions in the moment. Obviously, the art style is different. There are particular traits, but I think it sort of shows the power of these tools, even with the different drawing styles and the abstraction here, and the less specificity and the more romantic notions, and the higher degree of specificity and the more intense cultural and emotional issues that Fabrice is dealing with. These tools work really well. So I started thinking this was an interesting to present because I do a much shorter abbreviated version of this in my class to talk about wordless conversations and flow and page design in comics. And hopefully this gives you guys some ideas. I haven't gotten any questions that I see in the chat. I think we're down to about 10 minutes or so. So let me know if you do. So I guess as I'm looking through some more pages with you, just to let you know, I am teaching making comics next semester at Zen Studio. That's a beautiful one. There's this cat reoccurs from the first scene, and here it's fighting a rat. That's really nice. So the upper part of the panel, all black and white gray, and then we have this ink wash or watercolor or something for the reflection of the sky. So yeah, I teach my making comics class in a bit, and things like this and page design are a particular area of interest for me. I think there was also, oh yeah, there we go. This is like a fantasy sequence. Scale. I think the contrast between these intensely repetitive scenes and the much less. So it's also an interesting device. Oh, yeah, the art gallery. This is like a running joke. Black canvases. I think there's one of these black canvases in every museum in the world. We saw this earlier. This is the author of the book Cages, that the book Cages is named after. I think it's sort of relevant. Let's look here. At the end of this book, I know things have gotten complicated for Fabrice. And at the end, it's much more about him processing things. You have less of these sort of narrative vignettes and more monologue. And it's a journal, of course. I think that's right. It goes to good and a follow. That's very intense. he finds, well, at least I'm reading, he finds something in the festivities and partying here. Yeah, that's the end there. So it has like a, I'm not sure if you call it positive, but somewhat upbeat ending with his friend. I think that's all I got to say about this. So I'm gonna, yeah. So, definitely influenced by these books is the book I mentioned earlier on, Dream Life. Or, whoops, not this way. Dream Life. There's things in Revolver, and there will be things in Mind Engine that are also influenced by what you see here. But as far as like sort of creative journeys, the book Dream Life is probably the most akin to Cage's in terms of being just one person getting their ideas and exploring magic realism and symbolism. You can find it on Amazon to order directly, or on my, I have a Gumroad link off of my site to order it there or get digital versions. It's also on Comixology, all of those usual places. And of course, again, if you join me on Patreon, you can get all of my independent stuff digitally downloaded free. I also have a student patron category on Patreon. So for $10 a month, you get one-on-one consultations. I'll look at your work as an artist or a comic artist. Either way, you don't have to make comics necessarily. It's art tutelage as opposed to specifically just comics, but I also do comics tutelage. And I also teach at Sin Studio, which is an art school in downtown Montreal. And we do concept art and traditional and digital mediums, modes, modalities. I'm blanking on the word right now, like sort of the equivalent of the arts plastic, but I guess the digital arts, the art digital. And our programs have all gone online for at least the next little while. We'll get back to having classes in classrooms eventually, but in the meantime, you can sign up from anywhere in the world, and certainly somewhere in Montreal, as long as you have a good connection, and join us in our Zoom classrooms. I'm also organizing comic jams. We had one a couple days ago for FBDM, and they'll probably be one on the first Friday of every month for the next little while. And that comic jam is a bunch of cartoonists sit in a room together, or not, as the case is now. We'll sit in a Zoom room together, and we do improv comics together. One person does a panel, passes it on, someone else adds a panel, and it's usually fun and silly, and also a chance to socialize. So that's something that cartoonists willingly give up a lot of times to do our books, these big, thick books. If you feel like joining us, check that out. The links and things will be on my site, or if you go to salonbdmtl.spiltink.org. I believe is the URL for the comic salon. Yeah, it's my site, so I should know, but I have to keep track of these things. All right, I think we're wrapping up. Hope you've enjoyed the day of FBDM. I'm aware someone was asking me. The videos will all be up eventually. I think they have to edit them and stuff. And if you got more questions, just ask me. I'll go check out Ask Me on Twitter, or say something in the comments on the video on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll eventually track it down.